Hello, and welcome to GameMaker's Journal. In this video, I will be showing you my approach to creating pixel art close-up scenes that I use for my game called To Malbinsk, while I am using a more conventional approach to creating my main scenes, using concept art, over which I just draw pixel art. For my close-up scenes, I'm using 3D renders made in Blender as a base for my pixel art. This allows me to get loads of details that I don't have to make by hand, and I pretty much love that old school, low-res 3D aesthetic. I will be using Photoshop for compositing and also for finalizing this process and refining the pixel art. I will be showing you the whole workflow that I'm using and that works for me, but this is not going to be a detailed modeling tutorial or a detailed pixel art tutorial. It will be focusing mostly on the workflow and on some tips and tricks along the way that allowed me to make art quickly and for it to look awesome. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. As you can see, at this point, I already modeled a part of this scene in Blender. I made just enough for me to be able to insert this scene as a placeholder into Unity and make it work. Now that I know that everything works in-game and that I won't have to make any changes to gameplay, I can make the final art. Let's start with reference. I use this old Soviet generator as a reference while modeling my generator. Now I want to incorporate more details from this reference in the final design. I will be starting with the largest element first, and that is this engine part of the generator. The whole modeling process is pretty loose, since all the finer details will get lost in the end due to the low resolution of the artwork. Therefore, I focus mainly on large forms and silhouettes of the objects. But of course, sometimes I do get carried away. Like for example here, where I added these bolts to the engine thinking they will be visible in the end, but they ended up being just a few pixels in the final artwork. And yes, this pretty much demonstrates quite well the level of detail you don't have to create in 3D, since they will end up being totally insignificant in the end. Afterwards, I moved on to make this fuel reservoir look more interesting with those surface details. This, on the other hand, is a detail that is worth the effort, since it adds a lot to the final artwork in the end. I constantly have to think of the end result while making decisions regarding what to focus on. I reused this part of the cable to create this hose and then moved on to create this interesting looking part. It has an interesting shape and silhouette, and if I make it look like black rubber, like that hose, it will make a nice contrast to the rest of the scene. Next in line was this smaller metal reservoir thing to fill this empty space. The job I had here was to make this thing look like a functional generator while removing all of the unnecessary complexities. I still wanted it to look believable, so I had to make it just complex enough. I think this element is just what I needed for me to achieve that. No need for more parts to be added after this. It was time for me to focus on the background elements and on color. I inserted the main scene as a plane, and that will allow me to use it as a reference for object placement and for me to pick colors directly from the existing scene. As you can see, I'm changing the viewport display color in the material settings and not the base color of the material. This is because I made a decision to use the matte cap as a final render for further compositing in Photoshop. This way, I don't have to unwrap any of the models. I will be adding all necessary details in Photoshop, which will be faster than unwrapping and texturing in Blender. This also gives everything more of a plastic look, and that doesn't look that great in itself, but when converted to pixel art, it looks better than more realistic looking materials that I would get, for example, if I used Cycles or Eevee. This way it looks flatter, more cartoony, and in line with the main scene. just what I need. You can tweak a lot of matcap settings if you click on this arrow while in viewport shading mode, like ambient occlusion settings. You do that by adjusting the ridge and valley sliders. You can also tweak the shadow intensity, and if you click on the cog next to the shadow slider, you can also change the shadow direction. The chain link fence in the background is one of the rare objects that need to be rendered in Eevee since the chain link is a texture. This is a model I reused from a previous project, so I didn't have to model or texture that. Here I am making a sort of a color ID for the floor since I know I will need it later in Photoshop for easy selection while compositing. Then I made sure everything was in the appropriate collection in preparation for rendering. Right side of the generator has elements that the player interacts with during gameplay, and I didn't work on them here that much since they were set up in the placeholder phase. I just wanted to mention that most of them have two states, on or off. I separated those two states as different objects in two different collections that I will render separately. I thought that I might try to use the Eevee render for a more realistic material just for this canister, but in hindsight it was clearly a mistake and I will have to replace that element in the future. Anyway, here I just changed all of the object colors to match the scene and I was pretty much ready for rendering. You can render matcap, but in a bit of a different way than the one you are used to. You have to go to View and then click Viewport Render Image. Just make sure to turn off the overlays if you're rendering something with a transparent background, or you will end up rendering the grid and other overlays as well. You also have to be in viewport shading mode to render matcap in this way. So here I just go and turn on one group after the other and render it out. I use the same approach for the things I want to render using Eevee. I just have to change the mode and then again viewport render. This way I don't have to spend time making render layers. And this is pretty much it for Blender, and we can just jump to Photoshop. This is what I ended up with. I used the purple color to make a selection using the wand tool, and I made the layer mask for the background using that selection. I also ended up making a version of the matcap render without shadow that ended up being pretty useful in the end. The wood elements in the scene were also models reused from the previous project, so they were textured as well. I ended up using that texture since, I already had it. Then I blended the wood texture with the scene using overlay blend mode and changed the opacity. Then I wanted to add a texture for the ground, and I used this asphalt texture I had. I adjusted the perspective a bit and blended it with overlay blend mode once again. Now I also wanted to start the process of lighting the scene. Renders have just directional shadows and not much else, so this step is quite important. This is the thing that will give the scene its mood and make it interesting. Also, it will guide the player's attention to the important elements in the scene. I do this mostly by adding a brightness contrast adjustment layer, adjusting the brightness and contrast. In this case, I want to make things brighter. Then I add a layer mask and invert it. You can do that by selecting the mask and just pressing Ctrl+I. And yes, then I use a soft round brush to reveal the parts of the scene I want to affect. At this point, I also want to add snow to the scene. Chalk brush works great for that. You can make nice stylized looking snow that will work great in most cases, especially for this when we are going to downscale the scene and don't need a ton of details. Just go around and gently tap the brush. You don't even need to use a graphics tablet to achieve good results. For this, I didn't even bother to take out my trusty Wacom, I just made everything with my mouse. Next, I used some metal textures I had and started adding the details to the generator surface. I adjusted the texture with regards to perspective and set the blend mode to soft light. Then I proceeded to mask the texture, removing it from regions I didn't want to affect by it. Afterwards, I added some stain textures and blended them in as well. Then I proceeded to adjust the lighting of the scene some more. I wanted to add this vignette effect so that the main focus of the scene pops out a bit more. I often zoom out and always look at how the scene looks in Navigator, since this is more of an accurate representation of the final downscaled artwork. I added some stains to the boards as well. Then I wanted to fix the lighting of the barrel, and I used the same trick as before to do so. Brightness, contrast, and masking. Did the same for the boards, and then I decided that the shadows on the generator itself were too dark. They were almost completely black, so I needed to fix this. This time the brightness contrast would not do the trick, so I masked the Eevee renders on top of the madcap renders to get the details and color I needed from them. After that, I decided that the main on-off switch needs something extra, so I made this plastic rim for it. This is achieved just with a rounded rectangle shape and a drop shadow layer style, quick and dirty. But it does the job quite well, and now the switch sits on the generator much better. The tank lid also needed something extra, so I decided to make some surface details. With a hard brush, I added a circle, fixed its perspective a bit, and then once more, I used layer styles, this time bevel and emboss. As you can see, I use layer styles a lot, and you should too. They're your friends. Now, it was time to make all the preparations for downscaling. Merge all the layers that need to be merged, name everything properly, and so on. As for the naming, if I name everything is in the placeholder PSB file I used in Unity, I can just pretty much replace the file entirely and everything will keep working like it used to in-game. It will just replace the placeholder art with the final one, so yes, naming is pretty important here. I used the original Photoshop document for naming reference. The resolution I'm using is just 277 by 156 pixels. I'm not strict about this. If a scene needs a bit higher resolution, yes, I will raise it, but in the end it will still be pretty low res. The way I go about downscaling is pretty straightforward. I make a new document with a size of 277 by 156 and I just drag and drop all the layers from the original to the new file. Then I will scale everything down, making sure that the interpolation is set to nearest neighbor. This step is really important if you want to achieve a nice pixelated look. Otherwise, everything will be just completely blurry. For this, I mostly use the pencil tool, and this is now just classic pixel art stuff for the most part. I go ahead and make some things straight, and I look around and get rid of some stray pixels that create some pretty harsh contrasts in areas that I don't need. Then I proceed to fix various shapes and just go around the whole artwork. And honestly, I just experiment. This part is mostly me just trying to figure out how to make everything work in these low-res restraints. So, yes. Here I'm masking the part where the glass would be, and I create that effect using a soft brush and some outer glow layer style. Again, layer style. At this point, I realized that I had some rather dark elements that I do not need to be so goddamn damn dark. So, right now, I'm just jumping around fixing all of those issues. I also removed the original shadow from the render since it was too harsh, so here I'm creating a new, better looking, awesome shadow. Next, I made a new on-off labels since the old ones were pretty gigantic. I also tried to make it look more interesting as far as the design goes. The only thing left to do, pretty much, is remove all of the remaining parts of the image that have a way too strong contrast. This is something that will certainly happen every time you downscale an artwork. You have regions like this. It's not such a problem in the high resolution version, but like this in low res, when you have just a single row of really bright pixels on a dark background, or vice versa, the eye is just naturally drawn to those parts of the image. The problem is that is not where I want the player to look. There is nothing of interest there. So I just need to clean the artwork from all of the instances where we have that going on. Last thing I did was clean up the switch since it looked like it was cel shaded. It had way too dark of an outline, and this is pretty much it. Here is the final result. And here it is in game. I'm pretty satisfied with the result, and I hope some of the things will be of some use to you. I hope you find this entertaining, and please let me know what you think of this workflow in the comments. I will be making more videos on this and similar game development topics in the future, so if you want me to cover any specific topic, just let me know in the comment section. You can expect a lot of similar videos in the future, so like and subscribe if you want to see more of the stuff I create. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on the Game Maker's Journal.